Throughout the year, Book TV attends author events and book fairs to speak with nonfiction authors. We recently visited the National Press Club's annual book fair in Washington, where journalist Scott Tong discussed living and working in China as an economic correspondent for the public radio program Marketplace.
Scott Tong is a correspondent with American Public Media's Marketplace. He's also the author of A Village with My Name, a family history of China's opening to the world. Scott, tell me about when you went to China to open up Marketplace's first full-time China bureau.
Sure, it was back in 2006. I was assigned to open up a bureau in Shanghai with my family, so my wife and I were schlepping a 6-year-old, a 3-year-old, and a 1.5-year-old, right? 100 hours on a plane to go to Shanghai and open up this bureau. So every day was different, right? Some days it's just maddening with you can imagine the bureaucracy of a place like China where everybody has to sign up and fill out 12 forms and all these things to kind of get your stuff from the container. And then it was magical all at the same time. I got to go back to the town where my mom was born and really kind of live in the middle of this Chinese economic story, which has all these adjectives attached to it. It's kind of magical and fascinating and frustrating and unequal and all of those things. And obviously it matters to the world and it matters to America. So great opportunity to go. I was able to stay for 4 years before coming back.
Scott, I have 2 questions. They're professional and they're personal.
Yeah.
Let's start professional. What is it like to be a journalist in China? How much access do you get?
You know, I expected to be quite restricted. And for people to follow me around and bug my phones, I'm not sure how much of any of that actually happened. I had great freedom to interview everybody who wanted to be interviewed in China. So I could travel I often went with my assistants, sometimes I went by myself, and went everywhere, with the exception of Tibet. So journalists are restricted from going to Tibet, at least they were at the time. Everywhere else, whoever was willing to talk, we could interview them. So it was quite surprising. And more broadly, in China, we in the U.S., we understand the restrictions, right? The internet restrictions and others, and people get followed and tracked in certain ways. But it was much more open, much more free than I presumed. And I think that reflects the Chinese people, too. I have a cousin who lives in China, and he says, you Americans keep focusing on what we can't do. You should think about the 63,000 things that we can do that we couldn't do just a decade ago. So that was a big surprise for me.
So you write in the book about how your family left 60 years prior, and when you went back, you went to your mother's village. What was that like, and what kind of connections did you have 60 years later?
We had pretty tenuous connections when we went back. When I went with my father to find his village, so this is the Tong Village, it took us a day to find it because we've been disconnected for about 3 generations. So it took us a full day to kind of look for it. It's along the Grand Canal, which is the longest canal in the world. Like our canals in the States, it's not so useful anymore. And so the Tong Village probably was more important back then than it is now. And so when we got there, it's a little small, poor village without, indoor plumbing, barely have electricity, like a lot of villages probably in the world. What was remarkable about it is what the people's names were. Because my father was the elder person, so he went around, and in Chinese you ask people, well, what is your honorable last name? And then the first person who came, he said, well, my name is Tong Guangde, so his last name was Tong. It's a pretty unusual last name. And we said, wow, that's great. When you meet somebody with the same last name, right, it's exciting. And then the next guy who came, and he said his name was Tong Daren, so we had the same last name. So we get very excited, and we realize pretty soon that the reason everyone is looking at us like we're idiots is because everybody has the same last name. And we're the last people to realize that. So it's not really a place where people from the outside come. And so in a certain respect, it's pretty special to be at the place where the story began, where the first mover, in my family kind of went out and eventually led to the United States.
Your interactions in China, you being of Chinese heritage, but being American, how difficult was that?
In certain ways it was not too much of a challenge because when you're Chinese American, people in mainland China, they realize they knew immediately that I wasn't a Chinese national, right? I speak Mandarin Chinese kind of reasonably well for here, but I have an accent, and so it's obvious that I'm not. And something about mainland China, which is different perhaps than Taiwan or Singapore, where you have a lot of ethnic Chinese people, is they definitely treat Chinese Americans as an outsider. So I may as well have been a kind of Caucasian person walking around the way I was treated by the Chinese nationals. It's kind of a low trust place, and so I knew pretty quickly who I was, and I was treated interestingly, maybe surprisingly, as an outsider. So people had the same. If they wanted to talk to somebody, they shared a lot of their stories with me, and if they were kind of wary of talking to somebody on the outside, I was similarly someone from the outside. There's one moment when it changed, is when I went back to work on my book. And I was not a foreign journalist there, but I was this grandson of China, right, going back to kind of understand the story, learn the story of the village, learn the story of my grandfather, who was a political prisoner, and he died in a labor camp in China. And just about every Chinese person treated me differently. These people didn't have to try to help me, and a lot of them did. So I saw like everywhere, it's a complicated place. There's a harder side and a softer side, and as journalists, we tend to see the harder side of places, dealing with official China. But as a grandson of China, I really saw the more of the heart, kind of the softer side of China, and it was rewarding. So, as a reporter, I often would talk about their story, and when I went back to work on this book, it was more of my story.
In your lifetime, you've seen the Chinese economy change 180 degrees. Can you comment on that, and can you comment on the future in this possible trade war?
Yeah. Well, what I go back to is what I know about where China came from. When my father left in the late 40s, his brother got left behind, and his brother lived through the famine. So this is the late 1950s, 1960. 40 million people died. The worst famine in human history. China has been through so many of these tumultuous periods. And when Mao came, there was something called the Cultural Revolution. And so China kind of beat itself into nothing until the 70s. And when I speak to my cousin, he's about 10 years younger than I am, he still talks about when he was growing up, and this is well into the 80s, their family got one bottle of milk per week. They still had ration coupons. So I still think about where China has come from the regular person's perspective. And there are a lot of people in China who are actually really poor. The average masks a lot of hundreds of millions of people who are still poor by the World Bank's definition of poverty. So it's a complicated place. There are a lot of people who are still poor. So that, to me, helps to frame where China is and to have an appreciation of where China is. Now, having said that, I guess the historians, the economists, generally believe that when China's been open to the world, things have gotten better. That's certainly the story with my family in this long stretch of time. When China's doors have been closed, people's lives have been worse. And so the concern, I guess, is if China's doors close, or they're kind of closed off to the world, or the U.S. government contributes to kind of this building of walls in general, this raising of drawbridges. When I think about as an economics and business reporter, thinking about human welfare, I worry that China won't be on the same trajectory as it has been the past generation.
Scott Tong, you may recognize his name. He's a correspondent for American Public Media's Marketplace. He's also the author of A Village with My Name, A Family History of China's Opening the World. It was published last year by University of Chicago Press. Thanks so much.
Thanks very much.
Keep an eye out for more interviews from the National Press Club's book fair to air in the near future. You can also watch them and any of our programs in their entirety at booktv.org. Type the author's name in the search bar at the top of the page.